Amidst our global warming crisis, we have a situation where the nuclear power industry, which can do nothing to solve the global warming crisis, and in fact can only make it worse, is attempting to sell its product in the midst of the greatest technological revolution we've ever had, which is the transition from a fossil nuclear fuel base to one that's based on renewables and efficiency, essentially on the energy that Mother Earth gives us and the wise use of that in all forms of industrial use, home use, and technological use. And so as this new millennium dawns, we really are on the brink of a green solar-topian age where we can have all the energy that we need, could ever use, based on natural bounty. And yet we have this residual technology, this 20th century pox of nuclear power that's trying to sell itself as a solution to the global warming problem, which it most decidedly is not. And it's not for a number of reasons. At the top of the list that the nuclear power industry tries to say is that atomic reactors allegedly do not emit carbon dioxide. You would think that this might be true given the nature of the chain reaction and fission and all those things, but the reality is that all nuclear power plants do emit radioactive carbon, and they also emit heat directly into the atmosphere, kind of eliminating the middleman of CO2. The reality is that all nuclear plants have cooling towers, one of which recently collapsed at Vermont Yankee, by the way, to emit steam into the atmosphere, which is a direct global warming agent. They are also emitting heat directly into rivers, streams, lakes, oceans all over the world. And in fact, we have recently seen the forced shutdown of the Browns Ferry reactor in Alabama because the river into which it was dumping its waste water exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a staggering reality. Here we have a technology that is allegedly going to solve the global warming problem, and it's raised a river in Alabama to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. It's also done the same thing to a number in France. France, the alleged poster child of nuclear power, has had to shut a number of its reactors because the wastewater from the plant has driven the river to exceed the 90 degree Fahrenheit level. It's astounding that 90 degrees is considered acceptable in this day and age, but I suppose if you're pre-boiling fish, it has a certain use. So for a very wide range of reasons, nuclear power is not usable as a global warming solution. Another most obvious source of CO2, and I will go through the whole fuel chain, but the enrichment process of making uranium ore into usable fuel pellets, which these little benign-looking cylinders that go to fill fuel rods. That process, which involves gasifying a solid state element of isotopes of uranium, is an enormous consumer of fuel and requires the output of 2 entire coal plants, which are, of course, themselves immense global warming emitters. So the fuel that is used to power an atomic reactor is actually inherently the product of quite a bit of global warming activity on the part of the human beings who produce nuclear power. But let's follow the fuel chain all the way from the beginning, and the reality can be made perhaps a little clearer. Nuclear power plants start with uranium. Uranium has to be dug from the ground. We have a very long history of uranium mines since radon, radium from radium was. Humankind has a very long history of mining involving uranium and other radioisotopes related to uranium, because radium has had uses for a long time, well over a century, and it's well known that people who go down into the ground in these mines and dig out the radioactive materials themselves suffer from an inordinate lung cancer rate, primarily due to breathing in radon gas. which is an alpha emitter, an emitter of alpha particles, and which is a very reliable cause of lung cancer. In addition, of course, we have the traditional mining accidents of mines collapsing and people being killed that way, as we've seen recently in coal plants. And there's no easy solution to the coal problem from nuclear power either, and certainly uranium miners are right there with coal miners in being killed in droves in these mines. The ore then comes out of the ground, and the ore needs to be milled or crushed, and so you have heavy rocks, and they're put through a milling process in which they're turned into sand, which of course is also very energy intensive, by the way. And these sands are treated with acid.
What is commonly used to grind them to pulverize?
Well, the grinding process is done in a traditional industrial manner with, pretty much the way we grind grain for bread. It's just crushed, and you have millstones and a milling process that requires large rocks to be turned to particulate sand.
But I mean, what kind of process?
Well, these plants are generally coal-fired as well. You do not have uranium-fired milling plants. I mean, this is not a closed loop here. So the mills do require also a global warming input, and that's the reality. Now the tailings then, the refined or the crushed ore is then treated with an acid solution. And this acid solution leaches out the parts of the uranium that are usable for nuclear power plants, but the residual, which is about 95% by volume of the so-called tailings, are literally billions of tons stacked in piles all over the West, primarily in Colorado, but also New Mexico and other states out west. And these are huge. They're probably actually the largest emitters of background radiation for the entire nuclear power process, because these tailings, these uranium mill tailings, are very, very efficient emitters of radon gas, which has been detected from the west as far away as the East Coast. It is detectable. There are very large quantities of gaseous radioactive materials, and they do show up on the monitoring screens in New York City and Washington, D.C., and they are lethal. There is no doubt that radon gas is a very efficient cause of lung cancer, among other things. And so then
well, don't they use big, huge earth-moving equipment to push the tailings around and carry the rock and all that stuff?
Yes, very large fossil fuel consuming backhoes and steam shovels and other sorts of heavy equipment are definitely used to move these tailings around. They themselves, by the way, become radioactive and have to be disposed of as radioactive waste in the long term. So the usable ore, the residual uranium, is then transported mostly to Paducah, Kentucky now, although Ohio has had a history of having enrichment done here. And it's then put through this extremely complicated, very, very energy-intensive process where the ore is turned into usable uranium fuel, and it is a process of gasifying a solid. So you can imagine, and then running the gas through a series of osmosis-oriented filters. It's an extremely complicated, demanding industrial process. Hasn't really changed much in essence since the 1940s, when the Manhattan Project developed the first atomic bomb. And in fact, there is radioactive material from those original processes of developing the bomb still not efficiently disposed of. So, this goes on. And so this is the most energy-intensive part of the nuclear fuel process, is the enriching of the fuel. The pellets are produced, and they then, of course, go to nuclear reactors. Now, these pellets are put in very long tubular arrays, and this is the high-level fuel that goes into the core of a nuclear power plant. None of these used cores has yet been disposed of in a high-level repository, But when they go into the reactor, the chain reaction is produced, and then of course there is a moderation with the fuel modification rods, the control rods as they call them in the reactors, and we have a controlled nuclear explosion essentially. Now we've been told right from the start, and much of the anti-nuclear movement conceded, that nuclear power plants cannot explode. This is not the case, as it turns out. The first real exception to that turned up at the Fermi reactor in 1966. Now, this was a fast breeder reactor. It was cooled with liquid sodium. And it's at Monroe, Michigan. And in October 5th of 1966, there was a very, very serious accident at Fermi caused by a stoppage in the circulation of the cooling material. And Fermi stood at the brink for a month of actually exploding, because liquid sodium exposed to air could have produced a very large hole in southeastern Michigan. And I was at the University of Michigan at that time as a senior. I was a senior editor of the Michigan Daily. We had an AP machine. We read the New York Times every day. I found out about this accident 7 years later by reading a book called We Almost Lost Detroit by John G. Fuller, for the Reader's Digest of all things, that radical left-wing publication. And I'll never forget, we were just starting with nuclear power, and I was sitting and reading this book, and I said, geez, October 1966, I was 40 miles away. And so it was very successfully backed out of the media for 7 years. Ironically, perhaps tragically, Hubert Humphrey, who was campaigning at the time, he was vice president, spoke in Monroe, Michigan the morning of the accident, or the morning after the accident, and eventually died of cancer. Now, we're not going to say that this was a direct cause and effect, but it's worth mentioning, we'll put it that way. And so this was one reactor that could have exploded. In 1979, the accident at 3 Mile Island, the owners of 3 Mile Island religiously denied that there was any melting of fuel at 3 Mile Island. And in this case, of course, we would have had the China syndrome, where fuel melts into a molten ball and goes into the ground, and this is allegedly goes to China. Actually, if it went straight through, it would go to Indonesia, but who's counting? So at any rate, the industry all through the crisis said, there's no melting of fuel, there's no real significant dangerous release of radiation. Two of the biggest lies ever told in American industrial history, because the fuel did melt. 9 years after the accident, the owners of the nuclear plant managed to devise a robotic camera that was sent into the core, and they discovered that about 90% of the fuel actually melted. And they stopped arguing about why the accident happened and started trying to figure out why the whole thing didn't blow, because they were very, very lucky that the whole thing didn't blow. And furthermore, they don't really know at 3 Mile Island how much radiation was released. The industry has denied that there was enough radiation released to harm anyone, but they actually don't know how much was released, they don't know where it went, and they don't know who was harmed. And they don't want to know. There's a specific reason why they don't want to know. The specific reason is that 2,400 people in central Pennsylvania have sued. 2,400 families have filed a class action suit, which the courts will not hear. There has been a federal judge named Sylvia Rambo who has given the classic catch-22 argument, saying that you can't sue for your alleged health damages because not enough radiation was emitted to harm you. But in fact, a representative of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission named Lake Barrett testified in front of Congress that nobody knows how much radiation was released. The reason being that there are stack monitors at 3 Mile Island, as there are at all nuclear plants. And these stack monitors are designed to measure the radiation that goes up through the stacks in case of an accident or even during normal operations. And yet, in 3 Mile Island, all the stack monitors were saturated with water, radioactive water, and went off scale. And so, however much radiation went out exceeded the amount of radiation that could be measured by the stack monitors. And so, you know, it's a complete, one of the biggest lie I believe ever told in American industrial history is that no one was killed at 3 Mile Island, because I actually went into central Pennsylvania a year. I was the only reporter that I know of that was dumb enough to go into central Pennsylvania and to interview people. And while I was there, exactly a year after the accident, they actually did a release, a purposeful release of krypton gas and other stuff that was backed up. And I have to tell you, it was the worst experience of my life. I did have a metallic taste. People were, you know, complaining, and I was going from house to house, and people showing me their scars and their boils, and this one who died, and that one with cancer, and the animal, the data, you know, animals are much more sensitive. They're smaller, they're closer to the ground. The animal stories from 3 Mile Island would just make you feel like you're in a Japanese science fiction movie. It's horrifying. And so there's no doubt in my mind, certainly that animals, and almost certainly, I'm 100% convinced really that people were killed at 3 Mile Island. There's just too much evidence otherwise. And yet the industry persists in saying that no one was harmed, no radiation of significant impact was released, and you know, now they have to admit there was a meltdown, but they say it's of no consequence. However, could 3 Mile Island have exploded? There are mixed opinions about this now, because what would have been required for an explosion would be if this molten mass of radioactive, you know, superheated material had somehow escaped, which thank God it didn't. The actual molten, it could have hit water. If it had hit water, the water table or the Susquehanna, you would have had a steam explosion of enormous proportions that could very well have done something close to an explosion. But you know, so for that moment at least, the American reactors dodged a certain bullet. However, in 1986, on April 26th of 1986, we did have a reactor that did explode. There is enough evidence that there was a fission reaction, a fission explosion paralleling the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, that it's taken seriously in the scientific literature. Now, there are people who believe it didn't happen and people believe it did, and we may not have a real resolution of that for many years, but the reality is Chernobyl clearly exploded. Whether it was a fission reaction or not, we don't know, but there was a very definite explosion there. It blew apart the containment. The American line is that Chernobyl had no containment. This is utterly false. The containment at Chernobyl was stronger than at least 30 American containments. The Mark I early GE reactors had containments much less robust, as they like to say, than the containment at Chernobyl. And this is you know, one of the lies that the industry is told that is bald-faced, but they stick by. And the amount of radiation released from Chernobyl was apocalyptic in scale. It did wipe out, you know, many hundreds of thousands of square miles and make it extremely radioactive, and it did kill many, many thousands of people. The birth defect rate, the childhood leukemia, stillbirths, malformations, sterility, thyroid cancers, everything you don't want to hear about happened at Chernobyl. Now, the industry, of course, has done yeoman's work in downplaying the numbers and the general perception of the effects, but it's horrifying, and to see, you know, the children, of course, are most vulnerable, and to see these hordes of children, many of whom have been taken to Israel, by the way, and other places for, and Germany and Cuba, of all places, many of whom have been taken to Cuba and Israel and other places to be treated. You know, tear your heart out is an understatement, really. It's just, it is apocalyptic. And could it happen again? Absolutely. Now we've had, you know, the question of, are reactors vulnerable to terror attacks? And, you know, since we're talking about the operational side of nuclear plants, you know, on September 11th, like everyone else, I was absolutely horrified when the planes flew into the World Trade Center. But my second reaction was, thank God they didn't hit Indian Point. Now, Indian Point is a reactor complex 45 miles north of the trade centers. The first plane that was hijacked from Boston flew directly over Indian Point. Had it dived down 1 minute earlier, it could have hit Indian Point. There are 2 active reactors there, 1 retired reactor, 3 spent fuel pools, very, very vulnerable cooling systems, control centers. Shortly after the accident, the terror attack, I wrote a piece that went out on the internet about what might have happened had the jets crashed into the trade centers. And this was the first indication for me of the power of the internet, by the way, because there was a ferocious response from the industry. So they were clearly taking seriously what was going on the internet. And uniformly the argument was, well, an airplane couldn't penetrate a containment dome. A, it's not proven, and B, it's irrelevant. We've never had an actual test, thankfully, of a large plane crashing into a containment dome. I'm not convinced that a containment dome could withstand the crash of a jet, and I don't know why anybody else would be, frankly. Indian Point's an old reactor. Those containments are, it's the 2 there. Those containments are not, they're not state of the art by any stretch of the imagination. And furthermore, even if the plane did not penetrate the containment, it could clearly wipe out stacks, resulting in very large unmonitored releases. It could completely disrupt the control room. Who's going to operate a nuclear plant that's just been crashed into by a jet? The cooling systems, the spent fuel pools, off-site communication, off-site power. If you shut down a nuclear plant, you need off-site power to keep the systems going, to keep the cooling system going. If a plane crashes into a nuclear plant and it takes out the cooling system, and you have to shut the reactor, how do you cool all that spent fuel and all that fuel inside the core? It's not possible. So, to my mind, September 11th should have resulted in the immediate shutdown of all reactors, but of course it didn't. Even to give full credit to the chutzpah of this industry. Even in the wake of September 11th, they've come through and done a study and shown to their satisfaction that the reactors are more terror resistant than thought, and have actually reduced security in some cases at the plants. I've just begun reading, and this may or may not be urban legend, but we can put it on there and see what eventually happens. The rumor now is floating that there are documents that indicate that Mohammed Atta, who allegedly flew the first plane, considered very strongly hitting Indian Point, but assumed that there were surface-to-air missiles there. Of course, if you have a nuclear plant, you're going to have surface-to-air missiles protecting it, and so he didn't hit Indian Point. There are no surface-to-air missiles in any American reactors. They're totally naked. There are no anti-aircraft emplacements. There's no protection at a nuclear plant from a jet crash. Any kind of plane, even a private plane loaded with explosives, could very easily get into it. Then there's a whole liturgy that's erupted about how hard it would be to fly a jet into a big jet into a nuclear plant. You could get a small plane with explosive. I don't want to be fantasizing here, but over the horrors of all this. But these plants are ridiculously vulnerable. It's astonishing that after September 11th, all the reactors in the United States weren't shut. They are pre-deployed weapons of radioactive mass destruction. Any terrorist with any kind of organization could hit a nuclear plant and do inestimable damage. If the plane that hit the World Trade Center hit the Indian Point instead, we wouldn't have had thousands of deaths. We would have had hundreds of thousands of deaths. And we wouldn't have had a couple of $1 billion worth of damage. We'd be talking about trillions. The American economy could never have recovered from a massive radiation release at Indian Point, of which the reactor is capable. There is much, much more radioactive material inside the reactors at Indian Point than was released at Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined, by orders of magnitude. And this is what we avoided on September 11th. How they can continue to operate reactors, let alone talking about building new ones, is beyond me. Unfortunately, you don't even need a terrorist attack to create an apocalyptic event at a commercial reactor. We just recently had a major earthquake in Japan, outside of Tokyo, at Kashiwazaki, where I actually spoke once in 1976, where you had 7 reactors that were damaged by a very large earthquake, which the specialists in Japan say could very easily be exceeded. This earthquake exceeded the design characteristics of some of these reactors by a factor of 3. And significant damage was done, radiation was released, and it's a warning of things to come. There are other reactors in Japan that are even more vulnerable to earthquake, and they are expecting, this was a 6.5, I believe, they're expecting an 8.0. All of Japan is on earthquake faults. They have 55 reactors there, all of which are vulnerable. It's astonishing that they even considered building these plants in the first place. The irony is that actually we have had a nuclear plant that was damaged by an earthquake in Ohio. The only American reactor that I know of that was damaged by an earthquake was the Perry plant on Lake Erie, east of Cleveland. And on January 31st, 1986, 3 days after the Challenger shuttle blew up, an earthquake hit northern Ohio, and thankfully Perry was not operating at the time. It was still in the final stages of construction, and pipes were damaged, pumps were damaged, roads were knocked out, bridges were destroyed, and the governor of Ohio, Dick Celeste at the time, sued to keep this plant shut until they could determine whether they could evacuate the area in case an earthquake had damaged the nuclear plant. And the courts overruled him and allowed the reactor to open before the state completed its survey. And the governor of a state is the one who's responsible for evacuating people in a nuclear emergency. And their study came back after the court allowed the plant to open and said, hey, there's no way we can evacuate northern Ohio in the middle of an earthquake with a nuclear accident going on. There are 2 reactors up there. So earthquakes, we've got Diablo Canyon and San Onofre, a total of 4 reactors in California on earthquake faults. Indian Point is on an earthquake fault, so is Seabrook, New Hampshire. And this is a very real danger that we face here.
I also, nobody's ever talked about the fact that they're always on a large body of water, rimming the coast of England, for instance.
Right, or the Irish Sea.
And the rising sea levels and tsunamis. This is the kind of thing that we're going to see more often.
Right. Well, let's talk about that. As we discussed earlier, the nuclear plants do emit heat into bodies of water, rivers, streams, lakes, oceans. This is because they're all on bodies of water. They require cooling because there's so much intense heat generated in the fission reaction inside the core that they cannot efficiently use it all, and so it gets dumped into the atmosphere and the waters. And the reactors on Lake Erie in particular, well, not only Lake Erie but Lake Michigan, the whole Great Lakes system, the largest body of fresh water in the world, totally vulnerable. It's being irradiated in small proportion by the nuclear plants that are operating, but God forbid an accident should occur, we could lose the Great Lakes to radioactive poisons, as they have done in the Soviet Union. Much of the water in the Soviet Union, fresh water, has been poisoned by radioactive production of power and of weapons, and this is really unconscionable and extremely dangerous and suicidal, actually, in many ways. Now, we can also talk about the so-called normal emissions that come from nuclear plants. People consider this a great minefield, controversial, gray area. It's been shown. Dr. John Goffman, who recently passed away, one of the truly great men in American humanities and sciences, a medical doctor, did much of the pioneer work on LDL, cholesterol, which I never knew. I knew John Goffman for 40 years, and never knew that he was involved with that kind of research. But he was the chief medical researcher for the Atomic Energy Commission, and was dispatched as a leading medical doctor and nuclear chemist, was dispatched to dissuade the public from believing that regular radioactive emissions from nuclear plants could do any harm, and in fact came to the conclusion way back when there were far fewer nuclear plants, that 32,000 Americans per year would die from so-called normal emissions from nuclear power plants. Now, needless to say, the Atomic Energy Commission was horrified, and did they go out and lower emissions and protect the public? No. They attacked the messenger, They told Dr. Goffman to change his findings. He refused, and was fired essentially for finding that nuclear power plants would kill people. He recommended very publicly that he didn't recommend that nuclear plants be shut entirely, by the way. He said they have to lower the emissions, and the industry said, well, we can't lower the emissions and stay in business. And so they stayed in business. And have 32,000 Americans a year died from radioactive emissions? Well, draw your own conclusions. There are far more plants now than there were and far bigger ones than when Dr. Goffman made that finding. And so we have this whole satanic pot here of all these nuclear plants. We have 104 in the U.S., about 440 or 450 worldwide. They are a major presence. We have invested about $1 trillion or more in our own nuclear fleet. And the worst is yet to come. For example, the nuclear waste problem. Everybody knows that nuclear power plants emit high-level radioactive waste. Those nice little fuel pellets that came from the ore and the milling and the enrichment and then wind up in the core of the reactor, when they have given up the energy that they can, sufficient to produce a fission reaction, they're taken out, and these huge arrays first were stacked in swimming pools, so-called, at nuclear sites, and then, as now, in so-called dry casks, which are really just ventilated boxes. That's all a dry cask is. It's a ventilated box, and they stick the fuel in there, the spent fuel, and it sits. And you hope nothing happens to it. Like somebody show up with a bazooka, or they overheat. We have had crumbling of these. We've had crumbling of the fuel inside the spent fuel boxes, the dry cask, and we've also had evidence of some decay of the dry casks themselves. But the reality is we have no central repository. Now, this is an industry that promised 50 years ago, when the first reactor opened at Shippingport, Pennsylvania in 1957, that a solution to the nuclear waste problem was just around the corner. Well, it's 50 years later. They want to build a new generation of reactors, and they still have no solution for the nuclear waste problem. The great irony is, of course, here we are, we're fighting over Yucca Mountain, this giant dormant volcano in the middle of the Nevada desert, 80 miles from Las Vegas, surrounded by other dormant volcanoes, if you've ever been there. I mean, I'll never forget, I was standing at the lip of Yucca Mountain, and I was talking to a truly, high-level geologist. And I said, forgive me in my ignorance, but don't those look like dormant volcanoes? And he says, yeah, they're dormant volcanoes. How long have they been dormant? Well, 5,000 years. How long will radioactive waste be radioactive? Well, 100,000 years. Yucca Mountain itself is a dormant volcano. It could go off. It has perched water on top. So you can see the earthquake fault going through Yucca Mountain. So God forbid there should be radioactive fuel in there. The earthquake goes off. The perched water comes down, turns to steam. Poof! You have an explosion. Very credible scenario. It's in all the documentation. Why are they proceeding? So far, they've spent $10 billion to build a railroad through this mountain. You get better rail service at Yucca Mountain than you do in most American cities, including Columbus, Ohio, where you have none. So, $10 billion so far. The industry estimates it'll cost $60 billion when they think they're going to open in 2020. Most opponents, of course, believe Yucca Mountain will never open, and a more realistic cost estimate is in the range of $100 billion. But the irony is that this industry has nothing if not a proliferation of irony. The irony is that the new reactors that they want to build would produce spent fuel, high-level radioactive waste, for which no repository has even been proposed. Because Yucca Mountain will be full, well, if it ever opened, all its space is spoken for by existing reactors, and more. So we are almost to the point now where we have as much spent fuel, high-level waste, sitting at existing reactors as would fill Yucca Mountain. And so if they want to build new reactors, they're going to have to propose and build an entirely new repository, which doesn't exist. Where are they going to put that one? In Kazakhstan? I mean, there's just no end to it. So and of course the transportation issue on radioactive waste is also a major deal. it's all well and good if you have a nice shiny $100 billion facility that opens in 2020 in the Nevada desert. How do you get the spent fuel there? On trucks, on trains, over the interstates, by all the major cities. 80% of the population will live within a short distance of where spent fuel would pass. It's a nightmare. It's a completely unacceptable, undoable situation that supposedly we had an answer for 50 years ago. We also, by the way, supposedly had an answer for insurance against an apocalyptic disaster. When it was first proposed to build commercial reactors, the industry said, well, we're not going to build these. The utility industry said, we're not going to build these because there was just a report issued by Sandia Laboratories called the WASH 740 report. And this report said that if there was a major accident, a meltdown, 3,400 people would die fairly soon, 45,000 ultimately would put at serious risk, and a landmass, ironically, the size of Pennsylvania would be destroyed. They chose Pennsylvania. And so the industry sees this and other things like it and says, we're not interested. Friend, we don't want to take this kind of risk. And so the Price-Anderson Act was passed in 1957 by Congress, and the Price-Anderson Act said that the owners of nuclear power plants are not liable for the full damages or even most of the damage of a catastrophe at one of their nuclear plants. So if you own a nice shiny nuclear plant and by negligence or terrorism or whatever, defect in the construction, the thing blows and you have a meltdown and radiation goes and people are killed and $1 trillion worth of property is wiped out, you just walk away. The federal government takes care of it. And God forbid you should lose your home. I mean, anyone watching this who owns a home, look at your homeowner's policy. Look at it. And there is a clause in every homeowner policy in the United States of America that says that the insurer is not liable for damage done by a commercial atomic power plant. Not liable for radioactive fallout. And who is? Well, technically the federal government. There is a pool of money, I think it's around $7 billion, maybe more, that the industry has put together for show, essentially, petty cash. And but if we have $1 trillion worth of damage, 999.99 million of it is going to be eaten by the public. There's just no way around it. And the owners of the plant, well, if they're sued, they can always declare bankruptcy or whatever, but they're not really legally they're protected. And this new generation of reactors, these great, safe, technically advanced, mythical beasts, get the same protection. And I guarantee you, without that protection, no one would ever even think about building a new nuclear plant 50 years after the first one opened. There's no other industry that even comes close. I mean, do we have liability protection for windmill owners or for solar panel producers or biofuel distributors? It's ridiculous. Only nuclear power requires this kind of federal protection. And only nuclear power requires a central repository at public expense. And only nuclear power is demanding this kind of kid-glove treatment after 50 years. This is not only a mature technology, it's a decrepit technology. It's been around for a long time. It is a proven failure. Nuclear power is the most expensive technological failure in human history. And now here comes the industry, and they want to build new reactors. Now let's talk about this for a minute. The poster child for the world industry is allegedly France, where they have 59 reactors and one, I think, sort of under construction, which is telling, by the way. There's not a big push in France to actually build new nuclear plants. They all come there and look and say, oh, well, how wonderful, you got all these reactors. France is going to wind power. Nobody wants a whole lot of new reactors in France. And there is one so-called new generation reactor under construction in Finland, and it's already 18 months behind schedule and $900 million over budget. And the Finns are having horrendous time arguing with Areva, which is the producer of this reactor. And in fact, there's so many problems that the whole deal that Areva has been trying to cut with China is on the brink, hopefully, falling through. And so we've already got the same kind of experience economically with the new reactors that we had with the old. Now, let's talk about the experience economically with the old reactors. Almost all the reactors that were built in the United States came in spectacularly over budget. I mean, to the extent that the Seabrook reactors were originally planned. 2 reactors were slated for Seabrook, New Hampshire in the 60s to cost $250 million total. The final product was 1 reactor and 1 partially built reactor, which I love, which sits there rotting away. But the 1 reactor that went online at Seabrook came in at $7 billion. That is a 28 times cost overrun, you know, at Seabrook. At Shoreham, it was another $7 billion for a reactor that never operated. For, you know, Diablo Canyon, Trojan, pick your reactor, Watts Bar, which took 20 years to build, they all came in hugely over budget. Massive delays. Now, admittedly and proudly, we in the anti-nuclear movement caused many of these delays because the plants were never safe. They weren't wanted by the people next to whom they were built, and we slowed them down. But it was primarily the economic situation that caused the plants to rise. Ironically, one of the real death blows to new nuclear construction was the Arab oil embargo. You know, Richard Nixon got on TV in 1974 and said, to solve the Arab oil embargo, we're going to build 1,000 nuclear plants by the year 2000. Well, first of all, nuclear plants have nothing to do with the consumption of oil, or very, very little. 4% of the oil that we consume goes to generating electricity. And about 4% of the electricity we use is generated by oil. It's a very small percentage. Ironically, the state that uses the most electricity from oil is Hawaii, because they don't let LNG in there. It's severely restricted, and they don't have native coal or anything like that. I mean, they could get all their power from the sun very quickly, but they don't. And they're getting there, but it's slow. So nuclear plants do nothing to solve the consumption of oil whatsoever. But they do raise the price of building nuclear plants. The tremendous quantities of oil are consumed in producing the components of nuclear power, and then, of course, building the plants themselves with all the heavy equipment. So the rising price of oil actually drove up the price of building nuclear plants, and will again. You know, and all these projections, the industry is now talking about $4 to $5 billion for 60 reactors as big as 1,600 megawatts. I mean, come on. The reactors that they built for $7 billion were about 1,100 megawatts. Some of them smaller. 1,100 is about 1,200 is about as big as they got. And the idea of building a new nuclear plant for $4 billion is absurd. It's complete bait and switch. And yet, even at that, they cannot get Wall Street to invest. Now, what the industry is doing is what it's always done, which is go to the government for subsidies, handouts, bailouts, loan guarantees. This time they're going for loan guarantees. And slipped into the energy bill was a sentence that allows essentially a blank check loan guarantee so that investors in new nuclear plants will shoulder none of the risk. You know, invest in a nuclear plant. If it blows up, well, you're still covered. You know, this is the whole history of nuclear power, and they're doing it again. Pete Domenici of New Mexico, the senator from nuclear power, has slipped into, without significant debate nationally, slipped into the energy bill this idea that the whole new reactor contingent, the new fleet of reactors, should be built with loan guarantees because Wall Street will not come forward to invest. I will tell you that Wall Street is clamoring to invest in renewable energy. You know, if you have land, if you have access to the grid and a contract from a utility company, that you got to drive people away from the door to invest in your wind farm. But nuclear plants, no, nobody wants them. Nobody wants to invest in them. But if the government's going to back it 100%, well, hey, why not? And you cannot simultaneously believe in nuclear power and a market economy. They're a direct contradiction in terms. I personally would take a totally free market in energy right now. Wipe out all subsidies to renewables. wipe out all subsidies to efficiency, but also wipe out all subsidies to nuclear power and to fossil fuels, and most importantly, build into the market the real impacts, the real costs of burning fossil fuels and operating nuclear power plants. And then you would see this a solartopia economy, a renewable energy economy immediately. It would happen overnight, because economically all the cards are in our favor. I will admit to you that in the 70s, when we first coined the phrase no nukes and first started fighting nuclear power plants, you know, our argument was, well, if only they wouldn't spend the money on nukes, but they'd spend it on renewables instead, we could have a green economy. Well, we were kind of talking through our hats. We really didn't have it. The technology wasn't there. You know, it was in formation, and you could see the promise of photovoltaics, and you know, windmills obviously were going to work. This is how big were they going to get? But it happened. In the 90s, the wind power business, largely led by the Danes, made it into the commercial realm, and they didn't perfect the technology, but they made it workable, usable, economic, powerful, incredibly profitable. The wind business is incredibly profitable without subsidies, and photovoltaics, all the solar stuff, biofuels, all coming along very, very rapidly, all with people clamoring to invest. Nobody wants to touch nuclear power unless the government is going to back it 100%. And so those free marketeers out there who are claiming that nuclear power is this and that, total hypocrisy. You cannot have a free market economy and simultaneously support nuclear power. It has never been able to survive and never will survive in a competitive energy market. So, you know, so is there a future for nuclear power? Only if governments get support it. And you know, right now we have an intensely committed, extremely well-funded nuclear lobby. They've hired a few so-called environmental types like Patrick Moore, who is not a founder of Greenpeace, Stuart Brand, whose company takes money from the industry, a few others, and Christy Todd Whitman, who, as far as I'm concerned, did a terrible thing at September 11th by not warning the public of the true killing power of the toxic cloud that came off those collapsing buildings. And they are waging a very formidable effort. And the sad part is that we had this tremendous awakening to the global warming problem, and now it's being misused and you know, taken over by an industry that makes global warming worse and is using global warming as a pretext to sell nuclear plants, which are a curse on humanity, and which we really need to shut down, and I believe we can if we choke off the money guarantees. And in the long run, I think we'll do that primarily because we do have the solution, and the solution is a totally green-powered Earth with maximum efficiency, and that's where we can go next. Along the way, not only is there an economic barrier to building new nuclear plants, we do have thankfully, some residual legislative barriers. And as we all know, in California, in the 1970s, a statewide referendum was passed, which required this, you know, terrible barrier of the nuclear plants to say, okay, you want to build nuclear plants, first you have to have a solution. You have to have a place to send the nuclear waste. That's not good enough anymore. The nuclear power industry says that's an unreasonable requirement. We don't have a place to send the nuclear waste, and we don't have to have a place to send the nuclear waste. And so they are now gathering signatures to put on the ballot a referendum that would allow the construction of new nuclear plants in California, where you have 4 sitting very near earthquake faults already. And they want to build new nuclear plants without a solution to the nuclear waste problem. They're going to pour tons of money into this referendum. It's going to be a very difficult fight. It'll be hard to beat. But hopefully the people of California will maintain this barrier against building new nuclear plants. They're talking actually about building 1 or more at Fresno. Now, I've been in the Central Valley of California. I want to know where the water is going to come from to cool nuclear plants built in the Central Valley. This, you know, a long time ago they were talking about building reactors at Bakersfield. and somebody raised this 5-letter question, W-A-T-E-R, and they had no answer. And they still have no answer. I mean, you cannot build in a desert. They did it at Palo Verde outside of Phoenix. It's a disaster. They're using sewage water to try and cool these reactors. You know, this is an Achilles heel. This is one of the few industries that has multiple Achilles heels. And in an age where water is becoming increasingly precious, the idea of using entire rivers in the middle of a desert to cool nuclear plants, this is pure fantasy. What will happen, should these reactors be built in the mythological future, and I don't think they will, but you'll have the great irony of nuclear plants sitting in the middle of a desert with enormous heat resource beating down. And I guarantee you, just as now Browns Ferry and reactors in France have had to shut for overheating rivers, this will happen almost immediately with any large reactor that would open in a desert region, where in fact you could have thousands of miles covered in photovoltaic and arrays and mirror arrays to generate all the power we could ever use. And so we hope we will be campaigning very hard for Californians to prevent this barrier from being lifted. And I do think it's, after 50 years, it should be reasonable for an industry to be able to dispose of its own waste and to fund its own capital construction. And I don't think that any industry that can't do that really should have a place in the new century.